Welcome to your Daily News Deep Dive. Today is February 27th, 2025, and we're diving into climate and environmental news, pulling headlines from sources like the LA Times, New York Times, the Daily Climate, and more.
Yeah, we've got a lot to unpack today.
Let's jump right in. There's a lot going on with the Trump administration's environmental policies. The Daily Climate is reporting that the Trump administration wants the White House to eliminate the 2009 endangerment finding. That's the rule that lets the EPA regulate greenhouse gases.
This endangerment finding is basically saying that greenhouse gases are a danger to public health and welfare. Getting rid of it could really set back federal efforts to fight climate change.
Do you think this move is in line with the administration's broader agenda?
It seems to fit with their focus on deregulation and boosting economic growth. It looks like those factors might be taking priority over environmental protection.
And the Daily Climate also mentioned those huge proposed staff cuts at the EPA. They said it could be as much as 65%.
Wow. That's a massive reduction in workforce. Cuts that deep would definitely make it harder for the EPA to enforce regulations and respond to emergencies. It would be much tougher to monitor pollution, do research, and take action against polluters.
That could leave a lot of communities vulnerable. And then there's the decision to halt federal workplace heat protections.
Right.
The Daily Climate reported that the administration has indefinitely suspended OSHA's work on national heat safety rules.
You know, with heat waves becoming more frequent and intense because of climate change, this is especially worrying. Millions of workers, especially those working outdoors, are now at a much higher risk of heat stroke and other heat-related illnesses.
It's like they're systematically dismantling environmental protections. Now we're even seeing concerning developments on the information front. The Daily Climate and The Guardian are reporting that federal environmental data tools are disappearing under the Trump administration. This is limiting the public's access to important information.
That's a big problem. Those data tools are vital for understanding pollution levels and potential environmental hazards. Without them, holding companies accountable for their environmental impact becomes incredibly difficult. It also makes it much harder to track changes in pollution and push for effective environmental policies.
It even affects companies like Elon Musk's XAI and SpaceX.
Yeah, it becomes harder to assess their environmental footprint.
And as if the news about data tools vanishing wasn't bad enough, the Daily Climate and E&E News also reported that the administration is shutting down federal electric vehicle charging stations. And they might even sell off thousands of government-owned electric vehicles.
Wow, that seems to go against everything the previous administration was doing to create a greener fleet and cut fuel costs.
This could end up costing taxpayers billions and slow down the shift to cleaner transportation. So far, it's been a lot of news at the federal level. What's happening here in California?
Well, the LA Times is reporting on a potential conflict between California and the Trump administration. It's about the state's 2035 ban on gas-powered vehicles. It was a big step towards cutting emissions. Now Trump and congressional Republicans are trying to block California's ability to set its own fuel efficiency standards.
If they succeed, it could really undermine the ban.
Definitely.
It's a bold move by California.
For sure.
The outcome of this is going to have major implications for transportation, not just in California, but nationwide.
Absolutely. And to add to California's woes, the LA Times also highlighted rising electric rates and those increasingly severe wildfires.
That's a tough combination.
It raises serious concerns about the state's energy future and its ability to balance affordability with clean energy and wildfire prevention.
California seems to be facing challenges on multiple fronts, but at least there's a bit of good news. The LA Times reported that California is increasing water deliveries because of the recent storms. That should bring some relief after that long drought.
It's welcome news, for sure. But we can't forget that the long-term effects of climate change on California's water resources are still a big worry.
It's true. Adapting to a future with more extreme weather events, both droughts and floods, is going to require some really innovative water management strategies.
Absolutely.
Now let's shift our focus to global climate and environmental news. The Daily Climate, citing The Guardian, reported that U.S. officials have been missing from recent international climate forums.
Oh, really?
It seems like they're retreating from the world stage.
It definitely raises concerns about the future of global climate cooperation, especially given the U.S. withdrawal from the Paris Agreement.
It remains to be seen how this reduced engagement will impact international efforts to address climate change. Meanwhile, the Daily Climate reports that global biodiversity talks are back on in Rome, but funding challenges are a major roadblock.
It seems like countries are struggling to meet their financial commitments to protect ecosystems and prevent biodiversity loss.
This lack of funding is a direct threat to conservation efforts.
It is. It jeopardizes crucial ecosystem services like pollination, clean water, and climate regulation.
It's a stark reminder that environmental issues are deeply intertwined with economic and political realities.
Yeah, absolutely right.
These talks highlight the difficulty of balancing competing priorities and making sure there's enough money for essential conservation work.
Yeah, it's a tough balancing act.
And speaking of political realities, the Daily Climate and The Guardian are reporting that Germany's recent election might mean a move away from green politics. Conservative and far-right parties gained ground, and they've been pretty vocal about their opposition to environmental policies, especially those aimed at reducing our reliance on fossil fuels.
Interesting.
It's surprising to see this shift in Germany, a country often seen as a leader in climate action. What kind of impact could this have on Europe's overall climate strategy?
It does make you wonder about Germany's commitment to its climate goals and how much influence it will have on European climate policy. It also highlights how complex the political landscape is. Sometimes economic anxieties and worries about energy security can overshadow environmental concerns.
That's true. While Germany's potential retreat from green politics is worrying, there's some good news coming out of the UK. The Daily Climate and The Guardian reported that Britain's net zero economy is doing really well.
Oh, that's great to hear.
It's a fantastic example of how economic growth and environmental sustainability can go hand in hand.
Their net zero sector is growing faster than the rest of the economy.
It shows that we can have both economic prosperity and environmental responsibility.
It really challenges the idea that climate action always comes at the cost of economic growth.
It's proof that a green economy can create jobs and contribute significantly to a country's GDP.
Absolutely.
Speaking of climate change impacts, the Daily Climate highlighted a study that found that rising sea levels are destabilizing not just coastlines, but also historical cities. I thought coastal erosion was the main problem. How are rising sea levels affecting historical cities, especially those further inland?
It turns out that seawater intrusion is a big factor. The Daily Climate talked about research in Alexandria, Egypt. They found that rising sea levels lead to higher groundwater levels. This water seeps into building foundations and weakens them, even buildings that are inland.
So these ancient structures are being undermined from below.
Exactly.
It makes you wonder what this means for coastal cities in California.
Scientists are warning about similar risks for California. Land subsidence and saltwater intrusion could really damage infrastructure, water supplies, and property values.
It just goes to show that the consequences of climate change are widespread and often subtle.
We need to start thinking beyond coastal erosion. We need to address the less obvious but equally significant consequences of rising sea levels.
Exactly. We need comprehensive adaptation strategies that consider the ripple effects on infrastructure and communities.
We have to recognize how interconnected our planet's systems are. We need a holistic approach to climate adaptation.
Now, let's talk about the energy industry. The Daily Climate reported that the fossil fuel industry is fighting hard against efforts to move away from gas in buildings.
They're using lobbying, legal challenges, and PR campaigns to resist policies that encourage switching to electric systems. Their main arguments are about affordability, consumer choice, and energy security.
It's interesting how they're framing their opposition. But doesn't this clash with the growing momentum behind renewable energy?
It definitely creates tension in the energy sector. Some companies are embracing the transition to cleaner energy, while others are fiercely protecting their existing infrastructure and investments in fossil fuels.
It highlights the challenges of transitioning away from established industries and economic interests.
Sure.
And this isn't just happening in the U.S. The Daily Climate, citing Grist, reported similar tactics being used in the EU and Australia.
It looks like this resistance is pretty widespread. It underscores the lasting influence of the fossil fuel industry, even as the urgency of the climate crisis becomes more and more apparent.
It's a reminder that transitioning to a sustainable future means navigating complex political and economic landscapes, places where vested interests often clash with what's best for the environment.
You're right.
We've covered a lot of ground already in this first part of our deep dive.
We have.
From policy changes in international agreements to the economic and financial implications of climate change. It's been a whirlwind of information.
It has.
But it's not all doom and gloom. We've also seen examples of resilience, innovation, and strategic communication that offer hope for a more sustainable future.
There's definitely reason to be hopeful. It's been interesting talking about the back and forth between the current administration's environmental policies and the different initiatives trying to move climate action forward. It's definitely a complicated situation.
It does feel like a constant battle. On one side, you have people trying to weaken environmental protections. And on the other, you have people working hard to create a more sustainable future. Speaking of that battle, the Daily Climate reported on a group of nonprofits that are determined to give out $539 million in federal climate grants, even though the Trump administration is trying to take back the money.
Oh, wow.
This group, Power Forward Communities, got a $2 billion grant during the Biden administration to support energy-efficient housing projects. But now EPA Administrator Lee Zeldin is calling it waste and abuse and trying to get those funds back.
That's a tricky situation. It really shows the challenges and uncertainty around federal funding for climate initiatives.
It feels like a direct conflict between the administration's priorities and the goals of those energy efficiency projects.
It does.
Do you think this could have a ripple effect on other green infrastructure investments?
Absolutely. Power Forward Communities is saying they'll honor their contracts. But this whole situation makes you wonder about the reliability of federal funding for similar projects in the future. Investors might think twice about putting money into green infrastructure if they're worried about the funding being pulled.
It's a good reminder that political changes can have real consequences for long-term projects.
Especially when it comes to clean energy and infrastructure.
Speaking of clean energy, we were talking earlier about the pushback against electric truck rules. It seems like another area where politics and economics are clashing with efforts to make transportation cleaner.
Yeah, it's a tough situation.
The Daily Climate, citing Bloomberg, said that California and 10 other states have mandates to increase electric truck sales. But those rules are facing legal challenges from 19 other states. It looks like almost half the country is trying to slow down the adoption of electric trucks.
Wow. There are a lot of factors at play here. Some people say the technology isn't ready yet. They point to the high costs and the lack of charging infrastructure. Others see it as a threat to the traditional trucking industry and the people who work in it. And then there's the political angle, with some seeing these mandates as the federal government overstepping its boundaries.
It's a complex issue for sure. But don't electric trucks have big environmental benefits, especially in cities where diesel exhaust is a major source of pollution?
They definitely do. Electric trucks could really help reduce air pollution, especially in densely populated areas. But the transition isn't easy. We need a strong charging infrastructure, and we need to address concerns about range and how much weight they can carry. Plus, we have to think about the economic impact on the existing trucking industry.
It seems like we're stuck in this situation where short-term economic interests are fighting against long-term environmental goals. How do we balance those competing priorities and make the switch to cleaner transportation happen faster?
It's going to take a multifaceted approach. We need technological improvements to make electric trucks perform better and become more affordable. We need strategic investments in charging infrastructure, and we need policies that encourage adoption while minimizing the economic impact on the trucking industry.
It's a reminder that transitioning to a sustainable future requires careful consideration of everyone involved.
We need to address their concerns and find solutions that benefit both the environment and the economy.
Speaking of economic impacts, the Daily Climate also had a report on how climate risks are starting to affect the municipal bond market.
That's interesting.
It shows how climate change is increasingly being factored into financial decisions.
Investors are becoming more aware of the financial risks associated with climate change. They're starting to consider those risks when making investment decisions.
It makes sense.
As extreme weather events become more common and more intense, they can cause a lot of damage to infrastructure. They can disrupt local economies and make it harder for a city to repay its debts.
So investors are basically adding a climate risk premium when they evaluate municipal bonds. Could this lead to higher borrowing costs for cities, especially those that are vulnerable to climate change?
Definitely. A good example is the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. S&P Global Ratings recently downgraded their credit rating because of the increasing risk of wildfires.
Wow.
This downgrade shows that people are starting to realize that climate change is a real financial threat. If this trend continues, it could become much more expensive for cities to borrow money for essential projects. Things like infrastructure improvements and disaster preparedness.
It seems like climate change is no longer just an environmental issue, it's becoming a financial imperative.
Exactly. And this change in how investors think could have big implications for how cities plan for and pay for climate adaptation measures. It underscores the need for proactive risk assessment, resilience planning, and innovative financing mechanisms that take into account the long-term impacts of climate change.
It's a lot to consider. We've been talking about the challenges and setbacks in tackling climate change. But even with all the political battles and financial uncertainties, there are still reasons to be hopeful. The Daily Climate mentioned a story from the New York Times about organic farmers and environmental groups. They're suing the U.S. Department of Agriculture for removing climate-related data from its websites.
That's interesting.
These groups are arguing that removing the data was illegal and that it deprived farmers of crucial information they need for business planning, especially with weather patterns becoming more unpredictable.
That makes sense. They need that data to adapt to a changing climate.
It's a powerful statement about the importance of transparency and access to information.
It highlights the role of data in helping farmers adapt to a changing climate.
It's encouraging to see these groups taking action and demanding accountability.
Access to accurate and reliable information is crucial for making informed decisions, especially when it comes to climate change.
It's a complex issue that demands collaborative solutions.
Mhm.
This lawsuit could set a precedent for challenging attempts to suppress climate-related information.
It really highlights the vital role data plays in making decisions, coming up with adaptation strategies, and building resilience in the face of climate change.
We've covered a lot of ground in the second part of our deep dive.
We have.
We've explored the complexities of climate policy, the financial implications of climate risks, and the importance of access to information. It's a multifaceted issue with both challenges and opportunities, setbacks and signs of progress.
It is. It's a dynamic landscape where political decisions, economic considerations, and scientific realities all come together. To navigate this complex terrain, we need informed decision-making, collaborative action, and a commitment to building a more sustainable and resilient future.
It's been a lot to take in today.
Yeah, there's a lot going on.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the scale of the climate crisis and all the political and economic roadblocks we face.
I understand. It can definitely be disheartening. But even with all the challenges, there are also inspiring stories out there. Stories of resilience, innovation, and unexpected discoveries. They remind us that nature has a remarkable ability to adapt.
I could definitely use some good news right now. What
Yeah.
kind of positive developments have you seen?
Well, Yale Climate Connections reported something really interesting. They found that mangroves are now growing in Georgia.
Mangroves in Georgia. That's pretty far north.
It is.
I always thought mangroves were only found in tropical areas.
That's what most people think. But the warming climate is allowing mangroves to expand their range northward. They're pushing the boundaries of where we thought they could grow.
That's amazing.
It really highlights how ecosystems are responding to climate change, and it makes you wonder what other shifts in plant and animal distributions we might see in the future,
It's a reminder that nature is constantly changing and adapting.
even when faced with major challenges.
It definitely offers a glimmer of hope amidst all the worrying news.
It does. Speaking of adaptation, remember our earlier conversation about transitioning away from gas in buildings?
And the fossil fuel industry pushing back against those efforts.
Right.
It seemed like a pretty big hurdle to overcome.
It is. But there might be a way to make things a little more fair. The Daily Climate highlighted a strategy being used in Texas. They're framing solar energy as a path to energy dominance.
Energy dominance, isn't that usually associated with fossil fuels?
It is. That's what makes this strategy so interesting. Instead of just talking about the environmental benefits of solar, they're emphasizing its role in creating jobs, boosting the economy, and strengthening national security.
So they're using the language of traditional energy sources to promote a clean alternative.
Exactly.
It's a smart way to connect with people who might not be as focused on the environmental side of things.
It is, and it seems to be working. The Texas solar industry is booming. In 2024, they added more power to the grid than any other source, and they're creating jobs all over the state.
It's proof that strategic communication can make a real difference.
It shows that sometimes you need to meet people where they are. You need to frame your message in a way that resonates with their values and concerns.
This approach could be a model for other regions where there's a lot of resistance to renewable energy.
Absolutely. It's a valuable lesson in navigating complex political situations and building bridges between different viewpoints.
We've explored a lot of different topics in this deep dive, from political fights over environmental rules to the financial risks of climate change. We've seen setbacks, progress, challenges, and glimmers of hope.
We have.
What are the key takeaways you want listeners to remember?
I think the biggest thing is how interconnected all these issues are. Climate change isn't just an environmental problem. It's a political, economic, social, and financial challenge. We need to approach it from all angles.
It's a reminder that climate change is a complicated issue with widespread consequences.
To address it effectively, we need to move beyond simplistic narratives. We need to have informed discussions that consider everyone's perspective.
And even though the challenges can seem overwhelming,
We're not just watching this happen. We all have a part to play.
whether it's staying informed, speaking up for change, supporting organizations working on these issues, or making changes in our own lives, we can all contribute to a more sustainable and resilient future.
One step at a time.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the latest climate and environmental news. We hope you found it informative and maybe even a little inspiring.
We encourage you to keep learning about these issues. Get involved in the things you care about. And remember that we have the power to shape the future with our actions and choices.